Should we pause that recording?
Good morning, afternoon or evening. You're very welcome and thank you for joining us today for this webinar to launch WISEN, which is CEOBS remote assessment methodology for environmental damage in conflict areas. My name is Doug Weir, I'm a director of CEOBS and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we proceed to the content, a little housekeeping. If we're strict with our timings, there'll be a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the session. And should you wish to ask any of the panelists a question, please use the Q&A function to do so. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. The Q&A will not be recorded. Okay, so the purpose of today's webinar is twofold. Firstly, to introduce you to WISEN, and secondly, to encourage a conversation about how we could move towards a more comprehensive model of remotely documenting environmental damage in conflict areas and the benefits of doing so. We're thrilled to have three expert guests with us today who'll provide insights on three of the potential applications for remote environmental data. Hassan Partow from the UN Environment Programme will discuss assessment. Margot Wallström, who's part of Ukraine's high-level working group on the environmental consequences of the war, will discuss advocacy, while Professor Kevin John Heller at the University of Copenhagen will discuss how the International Criminal Court hopes to integrate environmental data for accountability. But before we hear from them, we'd better introduce WISEN itself. And to do that, I'll hand over to three colleagues from our research team. Dr. Owen Darbyshire is CEOBS Senior Researcher and Lead Developer of WISEN, while our researchers Iryna Babanina and Leon Moreland will share their experience of using WISEN to study Ukraine, Sudan, and Iran and the wider region. Owen, Iryna, Leon, the screen is yours.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here today. It's great to have so many people registered. I think it can be the start of a really important conversation more broadly. So I'm going to jump straight in with the why. Why the environment? Why care? Why do we need more data? Why CEOBS? Why WISEN? Well, when we think about the impacts of war, we often think about the immediate human consequences, deaths, injuries, displacement, destruction, and so on. But armed conflicts also damage the environmental systems that sustain life. They contaminate water supplies, pollute air and soil, destroy agricultural land, damage ecosystems, and undermine public health for years, decades even after the fighting stops. So environmental harm is not separate really from the humanitarian consequences. It underpins many of them. There's also the growing recognition that landscapes, ecosystems, and biodiversity possess their own inherent value and deserve protection. And key to flourishing societies post-conflict is a recovery that ensures that everyone has access to a healthy environment as a human right. And so recoveries must be sustainable or green. And in some contexts, this may even help with peace building. Now, I expect most of us here today to understand all of that. But we actually face the task of sort of articulating that to those for whom it's maybe less instinctive or perceived as less important. Now, over the past decade or longer, we've seen the emergence of global monitoring systems for many dimensions of conflict and crisis. Conflict violence, civilian harm, health, food insecurity, and displacement, they're all monitored systematically by civil society. And this data has transformed really how conflicts are understood, communicated, and responded to. They shape the humanitarian response, the media coverage, the research, the advocacy, and the policy, as well as being guardrails at times against disinformation. But when it comes to environmental harm and war, there's no equivalent global system. So environmental information from conflicts does already exist. Many in the audience today collect it and do a brilliant job at that. but it is fragmented across different organizations, projects, and contexts. We have satellites, conflict data sets, local reporting, open source investigations, some ground measurements, some citizen science, and some environmental impact assessments. They all provide important pieces of the picture, but these information streams, evidence streams, vary enormously between conflicts. Some harms are visible from space, others only emerge through testimony or through environmental sampling or local knowledge. Some conflicts generate huge volumes of open source information. Others are characterized by blackouts and information blackouts and silence. Um, some harms appear as discrete incidents. Others accumulate slowly across landscapes or ecosystems. Understanding each of these in isolation is valuable, but they are rarely sort of connected together in a systematic way. If there's no systematic documentation, then it's very difficult to be able to prioritize, remediate, or hold actors accountable. So what is not needed is just another data set, but a framework capable of integrating all of these fragmented evidence streams um, or tributaries into a sort of coherent flow characterizing environmental harm. And that's the need WISEN has been designed to meet. So WISEN stands for the Wartime IncidentS to Environment Database. I'll briefly describe what we hope it can achieve, how the framework currently works, and then pass over to some colleagues to present some actual results. So WISEN provides a framework for systematically documenting environmental harm. Now, the goal isn't simply to collect data, but actually to make that environmental harm visible and actionable. So WISEN, we hope, can support assessment and remediation, recovery and reconstruction, justice and accountability, research and understanding, and overall stronger protection and advocacy. Our ambition is for WISEN to cover all conflicts, becoming part of that global conflict and humanitarian data commons, creating a shared public resource for understanding and responding to environmental harm. We believe a sort of independent NGO like CEOBS is sort of well placed to help steward this effort, but only as part of a bigger network, a distributed network of researchers or civil society organizations, including affected communities. And I think that's over time where we would think WISEN would go. It would be increasingly populated, maintained by those affected communities with the contextual expertise and proximity to what's happening. So now I'll just briefly go through the WISEN framework and how we've implemented it in Ukraine, Iran, and Sudan. So WISEN is built around a three-level hierarchy, and it's designed to function across different conflict contexts depending on the information available. Level 0 is the broadest layer. This assesses damage to environmentally significant objects. Level 1 and 2 move on to incidents. Damage shows us what was destroyed, but incident-based approaches reveal how the environmental harm unfolded. Things like fires or leaks or pollution releases. Level 1 aims to capture and verify all incidents and put them through a risk screening. Level 2 then takes the most important incidents and compiles the information needed for a structured environmental impact assessment. Together, in information-rich contexts, this helps characterize both the breadth and depth of environmental harm. So, in a bit more detail, level 0 relies entirely on remote sensing and tracks damage to facilities whose destruction could generate environmental harm. We combine openly available radar and optical satellite imagery with infrastructure data from OpenStreetMap. Apologies, I have a little bit of a cold. Level 0 is especially useful where information is limited. For example, in inaccessible areas, information blackouts, or very active front lines, because it identifies significant damage even where detailed reporting does not. So far, the team has undertaken this work manually, but next week we're launching on the Zooniverse Citizen Science platform a way for anyone to help assess damage in Lebanon and Iran. By making this step participatory, we hope to sort of decentralize and expand this work. So level 1 moves from damaged facilities to verified environmental incidents. We collect potential incidents from social media, emergency services, news reporting, OSINT investigations, and curated data sets, for example, EcoDoza in Ukraine, and then verify incidents and assess whether they meet our definition. We then calculate an environmental risk score by combining a theoretical harm score based on the type and location of the facility, and an event magnitude score based on what appears to have occurred: fires, explosions, pollutant releases, or service disruption. Level 2 is where we then conduct a really detailed investigation into those priority incidents. For each case, we compile social and mass media chronologies, annotate satellite imagery, geolocate footage and photographs, and then follow up with subsequent sort of scientific or official reporting when it's available. Collecting all of this detail sort of allows us to undertake a structured environmental harm assessment of what sort of actually happened, looking at the likely pollutants, affected environmental media, ecosystem disruption, and local vulnerability. So here is a short video of what a level 2 document looks like. As you can see, it's very detailed, and we're building this chronology. Unmuted myself. So taken together, the framework this framework allows us to track both the breadth and the depth of harm, including cumulative impacts of facilities experiencing sort of repeated incidents. The result is a comparable and reproducible record of environmental harm that can inform action. This is true to the old English meaning of WISEN: to reveal, to advise, instruct, and illuminate a route. So now on to some results. First from Kyiv, I'll pass over to my colleague Iryna.
Thank you, Owen. Good day, dear participants. Thank you for joining our event. Now I will briefly present the results of our work focused on Ukraine. In this map, you can see the incidents with involving potential environmental harm for the time period from the very start of the full-scale war to April 2026. And as we already told, we include three tiers or levels of incidents, including the damaged facility or object, then incidents identified as having an environmental risk, and detailed assessments of environmental harm. In this map, you can see that the majority of incidents, including those posing quite considerable environmental harm, are located along the front line or concentrated around big regional centers, such as Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and also in Kiev. However, you can see by the map that virtually no location is safe from potential attack, as well as potential environmental harm related to incident. The map also shows the cumulative impact of incidents on the environment and this area. Could we move to the next slide, please? And now I would like to briefly present some of the facility types which are included in our database and explored. For example, if we talk about the agricultural storage, which includes such facilities as farms, fertilizer, pesticide, and agrochemical substance storages, then even though these facilities may be less visible than a big factory, their number, the dispersal around the country, and the hazard profile of these facilities make them a considerable source of cumulative impact. In our database, we identified 129 level 1 incidents, and so far we documented 15 incidents in full, which is far from an exclusive list. Such agricultural storage sites pose dangers related to fertilizers, which can be either, for example, if you talk about the ammonia nitrate, which has its own energetic potential, or create the environmental contamination with ammonia nitrates. Considerable cratering provides a pathway for a nitrate contamination of shallow aquifers, and in many rural areas, a lot of people still depends on wells or shallow boreholes for their water supply. If we talk about pesticides and herbicides, this is the class of substances with persistence in environment, with considerable environmental and human toxicity and a range of pathways of exposure, both to wildlife, ecosystem food chains, and humans. Another potential risk is the biological contamination. And for example, contamination with vegetable oils can be very detrimental for water bodies, resulting in rapid depletion of oxygen and dangers to the waterfowl. Next slide, please. Another example of the infrastructure or facility types on which we focus is the fossil fuel infrastructure. The pattern of attacks on fossil fuel infrastructure across the country is widespread and immensely damaging, including the strikes on thermal power plants, hydropower plants, power distribution substations, and fuel depots or fuel storage sites. The risk factors here include the fossil fuel contamination with such key pollutants as lead, vanadium, arsenic, sulfur, etc. In some cases, the transformer oils used in huge power distribution substations contain polychlorinated biphenyls, very persistent chemicals with cancerogenic effects. The fossil fuel attacks cause considerable impacts on air when the oil fires spread contaminants for a large distance and pose special dangers for the elderly, the children, and vulnerable people. Oil spills on the ground are notoriously hard to clean up and may involve disposal of the topsoil, and oil spills into the water bodies require extensive containment efforts and treatment with sorbents to prevent their further spread. Next slide, please. And another type of facilities which we are focusing on as a facilities with quite complex risk profile is the military sector. The contamination from military sector facilities includes the substances which are at the same time explosive, toxic, and quite hard to detect. Moreover, the territory of the military sites themselves poses the risk of unexploded ordnance contamination, and in many cases, it is inaccessible for any rapid remediation or cleanup. That is why it will require a very phased unexploded ordnance clearance and remediation. In many cases, the abandoned military facilities or destroyed military facilities effectively turn into a no-access zone. The military facilities pose the risk of environmental contamination with heavy metals, TNT, RDX, and their decomposition products that may be even more toxic than the explosive substances themselves and have the potential to migrate in the environment, for example, leak into the groundwater. Moreover, one of the problems is the detection with the detection of the energetic substances or explosive substances, because very few laboratories are capable of doing the process of detection, and it is quite time-consuming and lengthy test. Thank you, and at this moment I will briefly focus on the experiences of data work and then pass the floor to my colleague to present a different context. And even though we use a variety of data sources to collect information, we had to address the change in information space. For example, the security considerations and laws required people to stop sharing footage and imagery online, which made us to rely more on the satellite imagery and do a more thorough and time-consuming open source investigations. In many cases, we are using Russian sources of information, and even though we understand certain sensitivities around relying on this information, we do careful verification of such sources. And we do recognize that they might be important for capturing the broadest range of incidents and identifying risks related to the incidents, even though, again, we should focus on reliability a lot. We also combine near real time with retrospective capturing on data, and we try to use as much as we can of incident monitoring, including different impacts on the components of environment, legacy pollution or legacy issues associated with a certain site, and implications for remediation or restoration. Thank you. Now I pass the floor to my colleague Leon to present their WISEN experiences in Sudan and Iran.
Thanks, Iryna. Yeah, as mentioned, we kind of applied WISEN to the conflict in Sudan and Iran. In Sudan, we conducted 2 statewide investigations in Khartoum and Al Jazeera, offering a kind of a spatial and temporal snapshot of environmental impacts of the conflict within the country. In Iran, WISEN supported monitoring of a rapidly evolving regional conflict and enabled in-depth investigations into the Tehran oil fires. Together with our work in Ukraine, these investigations demonstrate WISEN's proven ability to support environmental monitoring across diverse conflict settings and levels of data availability. Just go next slide. We'll briefly talk about results and experiences of these projects, starting with Sudan. So in Khartoum, we documented extensive damage across all industrial areas within the state, which due to the complex kind of urban zoning in the city increased pollution exposure risks for trapped civilians. In Al Jazeera, Sudan's breadbasket state, we identified impacts on agricultural infrastructure, including damaged pesticide stores and intentional disruptions of the Jazeera irrigation scheme, which contributed to localized flooding in the area. The Sudan conflict highlighted if we just go to the next slide as well. The Sudan conflict highlighted the challenges of applying WISEN in a highly data-constrained environment. Communication disruption created fragmented reporting, leading to the concept of level 0 data, cases where damage could be identified through satellite imagery despite limited online evidence. The project also determined the importance of collaboration with local researchers for identifying locations and interpreting local context. Just go next slide. Turning to Iran, this map shows the kind of spatial distribution of environmental incidents identified by WISEN and their associated risk scores. Using this framework, we documented more than 500 incidents of potential environmental harm, including impacts on military facilities and major industrial and energy-related events. We'll just go next slide. And then, yeah, so during the conflict, access to commercial satellite imagery was suddenly restricted by governments and providers. So the WISEN framework demonstrated resilience to this by combining OSINT methods with open source Earth observation data, which remain consistently accessible throughout the conflict. And finally, just go next slide. WISEN is not intended to exist in isolation. Armed conflicts generate many different forms of environmental change and harm, and no single method can capture them all. Alongside incident-based approaches such as WISEN, a growing ecosystem of broad environmental monitoring efforts is emerging. This includes large-scale satellite damage mapping, landscape change analysis, atmospheric monitoring, and more beyond, often AI-assisted. Other forms of environmental knowledge are equally important: ecological monitoring, biodiversity observations, sampling, citizen science, local knowledge, and humanitarian assessments each capture different dimensions of environmental change. Together, these approaches can contribute to a broader environmental data commons for armed conflict, helping build a more complete understanding of how wars affect people, ecosystems, and landscapes over time. Within this emerging ecosystem, WISEN's role is to provide structured, contextual, and global comparable incident-based environmental data. And if fully operational at a global scale, WISEN could become a major resource for understanding and responding to the environmental consequences of war, helping connect fragmented evidence and support monitoring efforts, and make environmental harm more visible across conflicts worldwide. Thanks for listening. Let's pass back to you, Doug.
Great. Thanks, Leon. Iryna. Eoghan, so I guess now that we have a sense of the kind of data that can be collected remotely and how it fits into the wider information ecosystem, it's time to hear a little bit more about some of the three potential applications for that data, for assessment, for advocacy, and for accountability. Our first guest is Hassan Partow. Hassan is an environmental affairs officer with UNEP's Disasters and Conflicts branch, with more than 20 years experience leading environmental assessments and recovery interventions in conflict and disaster affected settings. Hassan, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Doug. Hello, everyone. Real pleasure to be here on this session, and thanks very much for the thorough presentation. I think that the WISEN is a very timely initiative. It's well structured, very well thought out. In fact, I was kind of debating what am I going to say, because it's very comprehensive in its approach. They've really looked at it from different angles, and importantly, as just shown by Iryna and Leon, it has been applied in different contexts. So it's based on experience. It's not just kind of a theoretical framework, but it's something that has been trialed and tested. And as UNEP, we're happy to collaborate with Doug and Eoghan right from the initial days there, and with Ukraine, and it's been a learning process. So really great to see how this now has really matured into as I was saying, comprehensive and very well structured and systematic way to assess these incidents during conflict times. Now, from an environmental assessment perspective, before we can begin tackling this, the first step, as we know, is to do an initial screening and scoping of the potential impacts. And exactly this is this is it, because this provides us the kind of the baseline of the incidents on and how we can structure follow-up assessment, especially in contexts where now it's much more difficult to access, to go in the field, engage with the key stakeholders, whether it's government, civil society, academia, research institutes, but really try to build up an overview picture of the situation. So, armed with this type of information from an let's say international agency perspective is really critical, so that we are able to have an informed discussion with our member states, with our governments, to be able to discuss what are the priority issues, what are the priority concerns, and then really to make those decisions and zoom down to the key incidents and areas that need to be investigated. I think there's really two key strengths that I'd like to highlight in this approach. One is that the WISEN model and the work that's being done is that, as you can see, leveraging a wide range of tools, remote sensing, different sensors, radar, optical, multispectral, etc. It's also doing the social media, monitoring all of that information and triangulating it, as well as all of this open source intelligence work that is mushrooming all over. So I think getting all of this information into a structured way and format, and then helps us manage this information overload that can be easily created, so that we can systematically and have a clear, transparent and rational way to look at these incidents, and gives us a sense of control, because you can be quickly overwhelmed, especially as the situation is very rapidly evolving. And then you can imagine if this is happening now, as it happens with many conflicts the last years, decades, to be able to understand the situation. And the other aspect that's other strength I see is that it's also based on this risk-informed approach, which is very useful and critical, so that we have a rational way on how we try to prioritize by looking at the vulnerabilities, the locations, and the magnitude of those impacts. But I think then maybe to conclude, I'd say that we need to also be very clear that the analysis needs to be caveated, in that this is an initial, indicative assessment that is, the stepping stone to a field-based assessment, which is, the full-fledged assessment. We can only go so far remotely, but we cannot go to the quantitative and really understand the situation on the ground using remote methods, but need to do the analysis and sampling on site to have that. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, to caveat, and then be transparent on the limitations of this type of remote sensing. But I think there's a lot of promise, a lot of opportunities, and I look forward to the discussions and engaging more on this.
Great, thank you, Hassan. I think as an avid reader of UNEP assessments for nearly as long as you've been writing them, it's useful to hear about how the remote data can contribute to the prioritization of assessments. But yeah, again, I think it's really important, as you say, to recognise the limits of what can be known remotely. Okay, so our next speaker, I'm really delighted to introduce our second guest, Margot Wallström. Margot is a former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, and a former European Commission for the Environment, as well as for institutional relations and communication strategy. She's also the co-chair of Ukraine's high-level working group on the environmental consequences of the war. Margot, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this discussion. Thank you to all of you who have introduced WISEN, and it's a pleasure, and I'm in awe for this whole system. I'm just very impressed and happy, and also to speak alongside colleagues from CEOBS from UNEP and the University of Copenhagen as well, and the launch of this database. And of course, if I can just make a quick reaction to and spontaneous reaction to what I've already heard, I believe that it's an enormous strength if you can partner with civil society or work with civil society and citizens, and that they can continue to also report, because to engage them is extremely important in all of this. And also, of course, the communication part of this, to let the world know about what is happening. So I was very encouraged by listening to the introductions. And of course, I think I have given kind of the same speech over the years that I've been working also as co-chair of this international group. But I think that maybe you will find it, you know all of this already, but I've tried to present the arguments why this is needed, because it's not given. And it's very, very difficult to talk about the environment in the midst of an ongoing war. We just have to be realistic and understand that. And how are we going to communicate all of this? And as you know, the environment has been treated as the silent victim of war historically. And I think that with the help of these kind of systems, we can actually change that. We recognize immediately, and this is also widely reported, as we can get the sort of the real-time stories about what is going on. The human suffering caused by conflict. We can see the lives lost, the homes destroyed, the communities displaced, and the suffering. But the destruction of ecosystems, or the contamination of soil and water, the damage to forests, wetlands, industrial sites, and agricultural land, all the things that you've already showed us here, often remains less visible, even when the consequences are profound and long-lasting. And I often think of that when I heard about that 300-year-old oak forest in the east. Those trees did not scream to the world, or the dolphins killed in the Black Sea. They were invisible to us, and although they can sing, as we know, but they did not have a voice in this war, but they were definitely victims as well. And of course, the environmental harm is also not confined to a single moment. It accumulates, it spreads, it follows a wind or a river, and it can continue to shape people's health and livelihoods and security for a very long time. We know that a cancer can take many years to develop. And this is why making the harm visible matters so much. And when environmental damage is documented systematically, it becomes harder to dismiss as a secondary consequence of war. It becomes evidence, it becomes part of the political record, and it also creates a stronger basis for action. And we often have often said this also in the working group, that it is not an add-on, it is not a luxury, it is definitely not to be dealt with later, only after the war. So this has been, I think, the central lesson from Ukraine, because Russia's war has inflicted immense environmental destruction, from the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam to widespread contamination from military activity, to damage to protected areas, forests, energy infrastructure, all the industrial facilities, as we could see from your pictures here as well. And some of these impacts are dramatic and they are immediately visible, and others are slower, quieter, and may only be fully apparent over time. But all of them matter for Ukraine's future. They matter for recovery and reconstruction, and they matter for public health and for food security, for justice and accountability. And as you know, that was one of the things that we were asked to look at as well. And they matter for the kind of country that Ukraine will rebuild after the war. And I have said also all throughout this process in producing our report that Ukraine and under its president has shown unique leadership in 4 ways: by talking about it, by making it a priority, by inspiring new methods and standards. And I think this is an example, WISEN will be an example of that, by insisting on accountability, and fourthly, by demonstrating, hopefully, how to build back better in practice. When we established this high-level working group on the environmental consequences of the war, our aim was precisely to ensure that these issues would not remain at the margins of political attention. And when we presented it to President Zelensky in 2024, it was built on a simple premise: environmental protection cannot be an afterthought in war, nor in recovery. It must be part of the political response from the outset. And of course, we have to keep an eye on this also, as the process hopefully one day will turn into some kind of negotiations on peace and what have you. So not to lose it also in the end game. And the first priority area of the compact is monitoring environmental damage. And that reflects a clear understanding that without credible information, there can be no serious prioritization, no effective policy, and no meaningful accountability either. And that is why initiatives such as WISEN are so important. Good data can help policymakers understand the scale and nature of environmental harm. It can support better decisions on emergency response, because this also falls by the side, I would say. Remediation and reconstruction as well. It can help journalists and civil society bring neglected damage into public debate, and it can strengthen the work of international organizations. And I do hope that also the European Union and of course the UN through UNEP and others, that they are also invited and will be on board. And also it can contribute to future accountability efforts. But perhaps most fundamentally, data changes the status of environmental harm. It transforms these scattered incidents into patterns, and it turns individual observations into a body of knowledge, and allows us to see not only separate acts of destruction, but that broader environmental footprint of war. And once that footprint becomes visible, it becomes also politically more difficult to look away from. So this matters not only for Ukraine, and I'm happy to see that also already work on Sudan and other places in the Middle East. I hope will also cover this. Because these environmental legacies from war affect generations, and yet our ability to document those impacts remains very uneven. Methods differ, data is fragmented, and too often environmental consequences are assessed late, partially, or not at all. So the value of WISEN finally is that it points towards a much more systematic global approach. It helps build the infrastructure for a future in which environmental damage and conflict is not treated as a peripheral, but as a core concern for humanitarian response, recovery planning, peace building, and so on. Ultimately, environmental monitoring is about more than recording destruction. It's about giving political weight to what otherwise would remain unseen, and ensuring that recovery is also informed by evidence, not by omission, and recognizing that protecting the environment in times of war is inseparable from protecting people, communities, and also the possibility of a sustainable peace. The priority, and this we had to start every meeting by saying the priority has to be the safety and dignity of human beings, of every Ukrainian child and woman and man. But it is also increasingly obvious that these depend not only on the end of violence and war, but on a healthy environment and ecological security, and we must fight for these too. So I can only applaud you and congratulate CEOBS on this important initiative, and I hope we will all be wizened and it will become a valuable tool for all those working to ensure that environmental consequences of war are no longer silent. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. Yeah, I think in many ways Ukraine remains something of an outlier in terms of the attention on wartime environmental harm, but there's so many important lessons we can learn from Ukraine and hopefully apply to other contexts. Okay, so our final short guest perspective is from Professor Kevin John Heller. Kevin is Professor of International Law and Security at the University of Copenhagen Center for Military Studies and Distinguished Recurring Visiting Professor of Law at the Universidad Torquato de Tea in Buenos Aires. He's an academic member of Doughty Street Chambers in London, sits on the advisory board of the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales, and he served as special advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court on War Crimes from 2021 to 2026. And while there, he led the development of and co-authored the office's policy on addressing environmental damage through the Rome Statute. Kevin, the screen is yours.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. You stole my introduction a little bit. I was just going to simply start by saying that I did lead the development of the Office of the Prosecutor's Environmental Crimes Policy when I was the prosecutor's special advisor on war crimes, and I co-wrote the policy itself. We formally launched the policy last December at the Assembly of State Parties. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Nandor Knust from the Arctic University of Norway. I know he's in the audience. He and his university were very important external partners for us in developing the policy. I don't have time to get into the policy in any detail, and that's obviously not the point of today. You can download it from the ICC website. I just want to very briefly touch on a few of the substantive aspects of the policy and then use them to discuss why the work that the Conflict and Environment Observatory is doing through WISEN is so important, or will be so important, to the ICC's efforts to hold perpetrators accountable for environmental crimes. So let me begin by briefly explaining how we define the three concepts that are at the core of the policy. And the first is the most important concept of all, and that is, of course, environmental crime. The policy defines an environmental crime as any crime in the Rome Statute that is committed by means of or that results in environmental damage. So the policy covers two kinds of acts. First, Rome Statute crimes that are committed by means of environmental damage, making the damage a material fact that is relevant to establishing a formal element of the crime. And then second, Rome Statute crimes that result in environmental damage, making the damage contextual information relevant to assessing the gravity or the impact of the crime, for informing case selection and prioritization, and for sentencing and reparations. The second key concept is then the natural environment, which you probably all know has no set definition under international law. For purposes of the policy, natural environment refers to the Earth system as a whole, including the biosphere, cryosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. And then the third and final concept is environmental damage itself. The policy defines environmental damage as any serious anthropogenic destruction, deterioration, or loss of the natural environment, including any impact on the health and well-being of a particular ecosystem and its non-human inhabitants. So the OTP believes that all of the crimes in the Rome Statute, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, even aggression, can be committed by means of environmental damage. And the policy provides a number of examples of such environmental crimes, and the OTP, through the policy, is committed to investigating and prosecuting those crimes when it is feasible to do so. But notice the qualifier, feasible. It's very important to acknowledge two important limits on the OTP's ability to investigate environmental crimes. The first is simply capacity, or perhaps more accurately, the lack thereof. There are very few experts on the environment in the OTP. So current staff will need to be trained to recognize the environmental dimensions of the crimes they investigate, and new staff will need to be recruited who have expertise in various aspects of environmental justice. But even an OTP with greater expertise will still find it difficult to effectively investigate environmental crimes. And here I could not agree more with what the Conflict and Environment Observatory says in its introduction to WISEN. Because collecting evidence during and even after armed conflict is so difficult, often impossible, remotely collected data is critically important to accountability. And that really is the OTP's dilemma in a nutshell. The environmental crimes it will most want to investigate will nearly always be committed in precisely the kind of conflicts that are the most difficult to investigate. Think Gaza, think Luhansk, think Donetsk. And here, of course, is where WISEN comes in. WISEN will generate precisely the kind of remote data, remote evidence, that the OTP will need to successfully prosecute environmental crimes. Indeed, such data will be critical to both types of acts covered by the policy. So consider, for example, a situation in which the OTP wants to charge a government official with the war crime of starvation, because he oversaw the destruction of civilian water supplies and farmland. Prosecuting that official will require evidence indicating the environmental damage in question was sufficient to make the area uninhabitable. Or consider a situation in which the OTP wants to seek a longer sentence for a military commander whose deliberate attacks on a civilian object, maybe a dam, maybe a dike, caused massive incidental harm to the environment. Without reliable evidence of the extent of that harm, ICC judges would be very unlikely to grant a sentencing enhancement. Now, WISEN will also generate precisely the kind of remote data that the OTP will need to make intelligent decisions about which crimes to investigate in the first place. As we all know, the OTP will never be able to investigate anything more than an infinitesimal percentage of the environmental crimes that deserve prosecution. Being able to access WISEN's database of environmental damage will help make difficult decisions about prioritizing certain crimes over others. And here, just as an aside, in terms of prioritization, I really want to echo something that Margot said. To be honest, it can be difficult to convince people in the OTP that prosecuting environmental crimes is important, even in the midst of mass atrocity involving people. This kind of hard evidence of environmental damage, the kind of evidence that WISEN will produce, will be very helpful in making the argument about why we shouldn't ignore the environment when we put together a prosecutorial strategy. So in short, although the OTP's new policy on addressing environmental damage through the Rome Statute is an encouraging development for environmental justice generally, the OTP simply cannot do it alone. Its resources and expertise are simply too limited. For the policy to succeed, the OTP will need to rely heavily on precisely the kind of data that the Conflict and Environment Observatory's WISEN database provides. So I hope that the two organizations will be able to have a long and fruitful collaboration together in the future. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. These remain incredibly urgent yet challenging times for accountability processes, but the new policy looks to hold real potential if it can be grasped. We are a little ahead of time than we planned, and I would beg the indulgence of our panel to see if they might stay on for another 10 minutes for the Q&A, which we'll be turning to just following a few reflections. If that would be right, that would be great. If you do have questions for Q&A, please use the Q&A function to post them. I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts and reflections on some of the other challenges we face, but also on the opportunities that more systematic and geographically inclusive monitoring could offer. I think when it comes to challenges, one that's frequently flagged and which remains the focus of a lot of our reflection is that of security. What are the security implications of near real-time data releases? Should we build in publication delays or other safeguards? If so, for whom and for how long? As you might expect, two further and linked challenges are funding and ensuring that you have the people available to analyze data. And how do we ensure that we can sustain and nurture the human capacity necessary to gather and analyze data, particularly in those periods between high-profile conflicts or for those conflicts that struggle for donor attention? It feels as if a distributed network here would be quite important. And while we're experiencing a period of high and sustained interest in the environmental dimensions of conflict now, we can't take this for granted in future. But what if we were able to systematically monitor environmental change across all conflicts equally and to a common methodology? How would that change our understanding of damage and how we prioritize it? I mean, we've heard some of the benefits it would generate for environmental assessment and recovery, for public awareness and for accountability, all of which can contribute towards increased protection for people and ecosystems. But would there be other benefits too? As Eoghan's indicated, our long-term vision is for a global distributed monitoring network, and WISEN is just an example of how methodologies could be developed and harmonized. We'd need to integrate environmental trends as well as incidents and be creative and participatory in how people can engage with the network. For example, as mentioned, we'll shortly be launching what we're calling WISEN Watch on the Zooniverse Citizen Science platform. It'll allow anyone with an internet connection to contribute to the analysis, initially delivering level 0 WISEN assessments for damage in Lebanon and Iran. And while we're realistic about the state of the international funding environment, with the loss of resources such as the MDAT database a distinct possibility, we're also conscious that public interest in the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts is at a historic high. And the same applies for needs in this period of geopolitical discord and accelerating environmental change. So that's why we're today also inviting potential partners and donors to collaborate with us to develop WISEN and the environmental data commons further. Okay, we'll pause the recording here and before we move to Q&A, but thank you to everyone who's watched the recording so far, and you can find more information on WISEN at www.ceobs.org.